How's it going, everybody? So, let's talk Charlotte, North Carolina, and where I think this housing market is going from here, and all the things I look at to come to that conclusion. I did a video recently on Phoenix. Basically, I'll have the same format where I'll talk through most of it. I'm not going to show all these visuals, but in general, if I were to just summarize before I kind of get into the details of where I think it sort of stacks up, it is a little bit better than, say, a place like Phoenix. Incomes are a tad better, the labor market's a little stronger, but it's not without its flaws. There's not a single market out there that is completely immune from the economic cycle. That would just be insane. So, what you're looking at here is six charts of labor data, but I will speak to all of these other things that I think are very important as part of the discussion. So, demographic trends, populations, households, the originate or the mortgage data, so origination, delinquency trends, and then the permitting and obviously the labor data and how it all sort of ties together. So that being said, I'll start with the population data because that's to me the best place to start because it flows through all sorts of information. What you will see there is that yes, the Charlotte Metro is growing, but it's getting older, and that's a trend you see nationally, but it's just still a little bit younger in the aggregate. It's getting older, right? But it's not quite as old as we are at a national level. Now, but that's just looking at how the population is growing in terms of age and that distribution. But it matters how it's growing. Is it growing organically? Is it growing from people moving there? And I would just say it's the latter for the most part. It's a lot of net migration to this market, the bulk of which within that category is net international migration. That's a larger theme we have seen across the United States. It's no different here. And I will not comment on that, but now you know. Um, okay, now that we know that this population is just a little bit younger on the whole than, say, the country, I expect that to flow through the household data in a variety of different ways. So the households are just younger on the whole, both on the renter and homeowner side. Now, if you were to say, look at the homeowners, there are fewer homeowners without mortgages. Only like 31-ish% are without a mortgage because the population is younger. They don't have necessarily a chance to buy a home way back in time. And I'm not talking about things like, obviously, like, you know, even with when I go through this data, who has what rate or unpaid balance or anything. I'm just kind of talking about the broad trends. But like, yeah, I mean, 31% don't have mortgages because they're younger, right? Around 40% of homeowners in the United States don't have mortgages. But if I look at really renters and homeowners and how they're experiencing inflation, really by that I mean like their biggest expense. For most households, it's going to be shelter costs of some form. So whether renting or owning, there's a couple of benchmarks that I look at. Because renters are subject to market rates, there's just going to be more of them that are likely going to be cost burdened. So that's a household paying 30% plus of their income towards some form of shelter cost. Around just under the national average of 50% are paying 30% plus of their income towards rent. So it's a little bit better, but it's heading in the wrong direction. In fact, when you start to dig under the hood and look at the various iterations of the household renter data, what you will see is there are pockets where there are a lot of younger one person households that are renters in this market. And a lot of that growth took place really around COVID. That's not a unique trend, but it is highly concentrated here in Charlotte. That is probably the most obvious weak link. But on the whole, without factoring in all those various iterations of age and size of renters and all that, if you're to just look at the entire distribution of renters, on the whole, it's still just a hair less than the national average of 50% plus being cost burden. Now, cost burden on the other side, in terms of homeowners, if you do see them cost burden, it's most likely going to be on the mortgaged households. That should only make sense. So that's where the focus really should be. Um, it's a little bit less than 30% of the households that are cost burden, which is good, but again, it's heading in the wrong direction. And that only makes sense because if you start to look at the origination data, it's not great. It's especially not good, really, like in the past year or two. And but is I've seen markets that are in fact worse. But now the new normal is now like 40% plus DTIs, and it's just kind of ugly. Um, I mean, you're seeing delinquencies pick up in this market as well too, and we've had all these crazy moratoriums. I only expect that to kind of continue. Okay, now that I've talked about that information, it's also important to look at stuff like, okay, well, what types of homes are in this market? And what you will see across a lot of the Sun Belt, obviously the Southeast, is a lot of sprawl. So there's going to be a lot of single family. But not only does a place like Charlotte have a lot of single family on the homeowner side, but it's even relatively more concentrated on the renter side. So over the national average of renters are single family. So if you were to think of maybe a home that goes from for rent for sale, or where all this like inventory could possibly come from, I mean, you have to factor all of that in. But I would just say in general, if you were to look at growth in renter households by structure, I mean, it's no different than what you see nationally. The gorging in single family rentals took place really prior to 2016. Did it stop there? No, not necessarily. That's true in a place like Charlotte. Has there been a lot of multifamily rental growth? Yes, absolutely. Um, but people will say, hey, it's just a multifamily problem. And that's just not true, because even if you were to look at something like multifamily or like renting in isolation, oh, well, do I get an apartment or do I rent a single family home? All those sorts of things. If you even just think about it just more logically than that, I mean, single family rentals are just more expensive than multifamily in a place like Charlotte and really all over the place. And you're starting to see asking rents really come down sharply. They've been growing for quite some time in Charlotte, but they're coming down at a pretty decent clip right now. And I wouldn't be surprised if you started to see some of those rentals move over to the for sale side of the equation, just kind of at a very high level. But anyway, if I'm going to think about, like, just by extension, something like permitting is showing really textbook recessionary trends where it's declining, and it's not declining because of just pure affordability. Okay, I know people love to latch on to any and every excuse that they possibly can to justify something like that coming down, and they'll say that it's just purely affordability when it's not. This market has plenty of structural supply. It's just been simply misallocated. When you look across these markets and when you factor in like these long-term secular trends of changing household dynamics and how that could possibly, cause a false reading on something like housing units per capita being at or near all-time highs, then what you're going to realize is that there is just too much structural supply across not only the market of Charlotte, but really all over the place. Okay? It just drives me nuts when people try to come up with all these excuses. I mean, a lot of those household dynamic shifts, albeit are still playing out, the bulk of that took place like 70s, 80s, into the 90s, and now we've just kind of been range bound in a lot of these, housing units per capita metrics and even the average household size metrics. And you can factor in things like declining birth rates and make general sense of these trends. It's not impossible, okay? I've explained that stuff at length. I've households are, in my opinion, have got to be one of the most misunderstood parts of this entire equation. People don't seem to be looking at that information. And even when I'm thinking about something like housing units per capita or the permitting or active listings, understand, okay? Just zoom out real quick. Just think about this logically. You don't need a fancy degree to just understand that these realtors and these lenders are trying to basically misrepresent the reality. Okay, right now in the United States, there's what? Around a million active listings, and there's 147 million homes. Of those 147 million homes, around 15 million of them are actually vacant. So they want you to look at something like the million rather than the fact that there's 147 million total homes in the United States, but they want you to focus on something that's like 1% of the whole pie. Or they want you to focus on the permitting, which we'll say it's what, a million and a half, two a year, something like that, they're throwing up. Again, that's a very small percentage of all homes. So if you're not factoring in what could all of the factors that could conceivably drive something like active listings higher, right? The household trends, everything I've just talked about. I mean, sure, the permitting, like obviously what their financial situation is, and the labor market trends, then what are you doing? So, to that end, let's just talk about the labor market trends in a place like Charlotte. I mean, sorry guys, I get so fired up about that because the like people who misrepresent things that bad should be in some way held accountable because that is insane. You would be laughed out of the room if you tried to pull that shit like in an office setting. If you were talking to somebody who knew like basic math, they'd be like, get out of here. That's the dumbest shit I've ever heard. Okay, sorry. This visual incorporates both series from the BLS, which measure local labor market health. Down here is the unemployment rate. I think there's way too much emphasis on it. I have it zoomed in. But that comes from the local area unemployment statistics, otherwise known as LAUS. Think of this as the household survey. What you can see is that it's in an uptrend, but it's a very narrow measure, the unemployment rate U3 on its own. And I think there's way much too emphasis on it. People aren't factoring in things like the proliferation of gig work or how we've had all this crazy international migration these past few years, or the fact that, guys, like there are actually unemployment rates for various industries out there, and this is an aggregate figure, and we have all this insane amount of government and healthcare, right? Job growth. That in and of itself is, I'll get to that in a second, that's a textbook recessionary signal. But this also incorporates in the establishment survey. So anytime you hear NFP or non-farm payrolls, think establishment survey. That's what they quote month over month, seasonally adjusted. Hey, we added this many jobs this month. This is what they're referring to. So that's CES or current employment statistics. And I'm just showing it 5 different ways. So here's the detail up here and over here. That's all the way 1996 to March of 2025. This is just that year over year as a stacked bar chart. Same thing down here. And then these 2 charts down here are just over like a much shorter time frame. But the establishment survey, like it doesn't make a distinction for multiple job holders. It doesn't account for the unincorporated self-employed. The reason I bring that up, if you were to think about things like gig work or what have you, so you do need to understand those basic methodology differences. It's also capturing where the employer is located, but in general, most people live where they work. They may not live in the county in which they work, but they in general live in the vicinity. So there's like a million and a half, give or take, jobs in this metro. A lot of it's in these cyclical buckets right here: trade, transportation, utilities, professional business services, but that's not all. And the reason I'm showing it year over year, again, is a stacked bar chart over here, over a long period of time, so you can see it through multiple cycles. Okay, this is why I have to pull it out of Fred. You can't see shit in Fred. Is because what happens is anytime you see something like healthcare and government accounting for the bulk of jobs, that in and of itself is almost a recessionary like indicator. That's what you're seeing here. You saw it here. It's a little bit less pronounced here. That's a problem. Okay, obviously the black and the greens falling off, including construction, leisure, hospitality. What is that doing? It's doing that same thing literally right now. Okay, um, and then down here you can just see those trends in a little more detail. So hopefully that makes sense how that works. And the same thing right here. But also just included the headline unemployment or NFP number. So if I were to just show this entire thing as one line, that's what this would be. But year over year, 6 month annualized. So again, you need to be kind of like skeptical of this trend where it's moving higher because it matters about like really the distribution of job growth. It is very lopsided. You shouldn't really expect that number to turn around. But anyway, look, that's a long-winded way of saying that this market, it's not the worst I've seen, but it's going to struggle just like every other market will. There's a lot of structural supply. It matters just, you know, really the rate of change and like how, when, and if I guess the Fed cuts rates or we can get the long end down. But I don't necessarily see a market like that or like this see like home sales just start to moon unless there's some sort of like motivated selling. So that creates a scenario where the labor market continues to soften because rates remain elevated. Home sales could, in theory, remain stagnant, but you're probably going to see like ongoing price cuts and things of that nature. And the higher listings go, it's the more a lot of these sellers are going to realize that it's just not what they've been told was really happening. There's no housing shortage here. It was a temporary allocation issue, nothing more. And yeah, you're just going to see some version of this all over the place. So anyway, I'll quit rambling. Okay, have a good one, guys.